What if the person sleeping beside you isn't who they claim to be? What if the beautiful stranger who beckoned from the moonlit shore was never human at all? Could the ancient chronicles of beings who shed their skin like a discarded cloak hold truths that civilization was too terrified to record? Welcome to the shadows between worlds, where we unearth the legends of those who walk between forms. Tonight, we journey through moonlit forests, where men become wolves beneath the full moon's gaze, to windswept shores where seals shed their skin to become lovers, and into the very bedchambers where nightmares take physical form to ride the sleeping. We will venture to the misty moors where fairy folk steal children, leaving perfect replicas in their place, and to ancient crossroads, where your own double might greet you with a smile that chills the soul. We will uncover tales of the Beast of Gévaudan, whose intelligence surpassed any natural wolf, of Selkies, whose stolen pelts bound them to unwilling love, of the mare that sits upon your chest in the darkest hours, and of changelings whose presence turned families into strangers. We will explore the curse of the rougarou that passes through bloodlines like a poison, the vardaga that arrives before its owner, and the terrible price paid by those who refuse to let their loved ones rest in peace. And perhaps hidden within these chronicles of metamorphosis and deception lies a truth far more unsettling than any fiction, that the boundary between human and monster is not a wall of flesh and bone, but a threshold as thin as moonlight on water, as fragile as the skin that barely contains what we truly are beneath. There are places in the heart of France where the granite bones of the earth lie close to the surface, and the Marguerite Mountains of Gévaudan were such a place in the 18th century. Here, vast moorlands stretched beneath an endless sky, broken only by dark stands of pine and the occasional stone cottage, its windows glowing like amber eyes against the gathering dusk. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of heather and the promise of winter storms. It was a landscape that bred hard, practical people, shepherds and farmers who knew that survival meant respecting the wild things that shared their ancient domain. But in the summer of 1764, a shadow fell upon this remote province that would transform it from a place of harsh beauty into a realm of terror that would echo through the corridors of Versailles itself. It began, as such things often do, with the death of the innocent. Jean Boulette, barely 14 years old, had been tending her small flock of sheep near the village of Les Hubacs when something emerged from the pine forest that bordered the meadow. The other shepherds found her the next morning, her body torn with a precision that spoke of intelligence rather than mere animal hunger. Her throat had been crushed with surgical efficiency, but the beast had not fed. This was not the work of a wolf driven by starvation, but something else entirely, something that killed with deliberate, calculated malice. The local priest, Father Antoine, blessed the girl's mangled remains and whispered prayers that seemed to die on his lips, for he had seen the tracks left in the soft earth around her body. They were the prints of a wolf, yes, but larger than any wolf had a right to be, and strangely elongated, as if the creature that made them walked sometimes on 2 legs rather than 4. Word spread through the scattered hamlets like smoke on the wind. The Beast of Gévaudan had announced itself, and with that first kill, it declared a war against humanity that would claim over 100 souls, before its terrible hunger was finally sated. Picture Jean Chastel, a local farmer and hunter, a man whose weathered hands knew the weight of a musket, and whose eyes had tracked deer through morning mist for 40 years. He was no stranger to wolves, had killed his share of the grey predators that occasionally threatened his livestock. But as the attacks mounted through that cursed summer and autumn, he began to understand that this creature was something beyond his experience, beyond perhaps the experience of any living man. The beast displayed an uncanny intelligence, an almost human cunning that chilled the blood of those who survived its attention. It would attack in broad daylight, showing no fear of humans, yet it seemed to choose its victims with deliberate care. Women and children were its preferred prey, but not exclusively. It would ignore a flock of sheep to stalk a young shepherdess, pass by a group of armed men, to single out a solitary traveler on a distant path. Witnesses who lived to tell their tales spoke of a creature that stood nearly as tall as a man when it reared on its hind legs. Its coat, a dirty reddish-brown marked with darker stripes, its massive head crowned with small, pointed ears and eyes that burned with an almost human malevolence. Its tail was long and powerful, tipped with black fur, and it moved with a fluid grace that was neither wholly wolf nor wholly something else. King Louis XV himself took notice when the death toll reached 30, then 50, then beyond counting. He dispatched his finest hunters, his most decorated soldiers, men who had faced down the enemies of France on a dozen battlefields. Captain Diarmel arrived with a company of dragoons, their blue coats and polished sabres a symbol of royal authority, but the beast seemed to mock their efforts, killing within sight of their patrols, vanishing into the wilderness like smoke. The king's master huntsman, François Antoine, followed with his pack of specially trained hounds and his reputation for never failing to bring down his quarry. For months he stalked the creature through the treacherous moorland, following a trail of terror that led through villages where mothers no longer let their children play outside, where the evening bells no longer called the faithful to vespers, but warned the living to bar their doors against the coming dark. In September of 1765, Antoine's hunt finally cornered a massive wolf near the Abbey of Chazes. The creature he shot and killed was indeed enormous, a magnificent and terrifying specimen that was stuffed and sent to Versailles as proof of the royal hunter's success. The king declared the matter closed, the beast slain, and for a few brief months, the people of Gévaudan dared to hope that their nightmare had ended. Jean Chastel knew, with the certainty that comes to men who have stared too long into the abyss, that what haunted Gévaudan was no natural wolf. On the night he finally faced the true beast, as moonlight turned the snow-covered moor into a silver ocean of shadows, he carried with him 3 bullets that had been blessed by the village priest, and cast from silver melted down from a medallion of the Virgin Mary, when Chastel's blessed silver bullet tore through the creature's heart. On that frozen January night, the Beast of Gévaudan fell with a sound that was part wolf's death howl, part human scream of release. The reign of terror was over. The Highland villagers could breathe again. Their children could play in the meadows without fear. But as the massive form lay cooling in the snow, steam rising from its wounds like departing souls, those who had gathered to witness the end whispered of what they had glimpsed in the beast's final moments, not the fading light of an animal's eyes, but the terrible gratitude of a man finally freed from a curse too monstrous to bear. The carcass was burned, its ashes scattered to the winter winds. Yet the question that haunts the Marguerite Mountains remains: in how many other remote corners of the world do men and women feel the change beginning as the moon grows full? Fighting a battle they know they cannot win against the beast that stirs beneath their skin. Far to the north, where the Atlantic crashes against the ancient stones of the Orkney Islands, with a fury that has carved sea caves deep into living rock, the waters hold memories older than any human settlement. Here, beneath the rolling grey waves that surge between scattered skerries, a different kind of transformation has played out for centuries. one born not of curse or corruption, but of love's most terrible bargain. Magnus Sinclair was a fisherman of Sandwig, a village perched on the edge of the world, where the northern lights danced green fire across winter skies. His cottage stood alone on a windswept point, its stone walls thick enough to withstand the gales that howled down from the Arctic, its single window facing always toward the sea. He was a solitary man, his wife taken by the fever 3 winters past, his children grown and moved to the mainland in search of gentler lives. On the night that would change everything, Magnus had been hauling his nets beneath a moon so full it turned the water to molten silver. The catch had been poor, his nets coming up empty save for tangles of kelp and the occasional crab, as he prepared to make one final cast before the tide turned. He heard it, a sound that seemed to rise from the sea itself, a singing so pure and haunting that it made his weathered heart ache with a loneliness he had thought long buried. Following the melody, his small boat drifted toward a secluded cove, where 7 grey seals basked on the black rocks, their sleek forms glistening in the moonlight. But as Magnus watched, transfixed, the seals began to change. One by one, they shed their seal skins, like women stepping out of silver gowns, revealing forms of such ethereal beauty that Magnus wondered if he had died at sea and found himself in some otherworldly realm. They were the Selkies, the seal folk of northern waters, and they danced naked on the rocks with a grace that spoke of depths no human had ever plumbed. Their skin was pale as sea foam, their hair dark as the water between worlds, and when they moved, it was with the fluid motion of creatures equally at home in air or sea. Magnus remained hidden, knowing instinctively that to be discovered would shatter the spell. But his eyes were drawn to one dancer above all others. She was younger than the rest, her beauty untouched by the ancient sadness that seemed to cling to her companions like mist. When she laughed, the sound was like waves breaking over smooth stones, and when she paused in her dance to gaze toward the horizon, Magnus saw in her dark eyes a yearning that matched his own. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, the Selkies began to reclaim their skins, but in her joy, the young one had danced too far from where she had left her sealskin draped across a ledge. Magnus, moving with the stealth learned from years of hunting seals, crept forward and seized the abandoned skin. It was warm to the touch, silky and alive, and he felt it pulse beneath his fingers like a second heartbeat. When the young Selkie discovered her loss, her cry of anguish carried across the water like the wail of a lost soul. Her sisters called to her from the waves, but they could not help. Without her skin, she was trapped in human form, bound to the land as surely as if iron chains held her. Magnus emerged from his hiding place, the seal skin clutched in his trembling hands. The Selkie turned to face him, and he saw in her eyes not hatred, but a profound sorrow that made him question what he had done. Yet when she spoke, her voice was like music itself. "You have taken my freedom," she said, "but I will not curse you for it. The old laws bind us both now. I will come with you, and I will be your wife, but know this, should I ever find my skin, I will return to the sea, and no power on earth will hold me." For 7 years, Magnus lived in a happiness he had never thought possible. His Selkie wife, who took the name Moira, bore him 3 children, whose laughter filled the cottage with joy. She was a gentle mother and a loving wife. Yet Magnus could never forget the sadness that lurked behind her smiles. The way she would stand at their window during storms, her eyes fixed on the wild water, as if she could see through the waves to another world entirely. She taught their children to swim before they could properly walk, and they took to the water with an ease that unnerved their father. On calm evenings, she would sing them to sleep with songs in a language Magnus had never heard, melodies that seemed to carry the rhythm of tides and the whisper of deep currents. The children grew strong and strange, with eyes that reflected light, like a seal's, and an uncanny ability to hold their breath beneath the waves. Magnus kept his wife's seaskin hidden in a chest beneath their bed, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured with 3 locks. But as the years passed, his joy curdled into constant fear. He watched Moira's longing grow stronger with each passing season, saw how she would sometimes walk to the shore and stand waist deep in the waves, her arms outstretched as if embracing invisible companions. The end came, as Magnus had always known it would, through the innocence of his own children. Playing in their father's room while he was at sea, the youngest found the hidden key and opened the forbidden chest. When Moira saw her sealskin again after 7 long years, the transformation was immediate. The human mask she had worn so lovingly fell away, revealing the wild creature beneath. "I have been happy," she told Magnus, when he returned to find her standing on the threshold with the skin clutched to her breast. "You gave me love, and children, and years of joy I will treasure in the deep places where Selkies sing their ancient songs. But I was not born to be caged, however golden the bars." She kissed each of her children, and told them they would always carry the sea in their blood, that on certain nights, when the moon was full and the tide was right, they might see her dancing in the waves. Then she walked into the surf, and before Magnus's eyes, she pulled the sealskin over her shoulders and was transformed. For a moment longer, she remained in the shallows, her dark seal eyes meeting his one last time. Then she dove beneath the waves and was gone. Magnus never remarried, though he lived another 40 years alone in that cottage by the sea. On storm-lashed nights, when the waves crashed against the rocks where he had first seen her dance, fishermen would swear they glimpsed a grey seal in the churning water, larger than any they had known, watching the shore with eyes too intelligent, too sorrowful to be merely animal. And Magnus's children, grown now with children of their own, would sometimes wake to find their youngest standing at the water's edge in the pre-dawn darkness, speaking in words no human throat should know, 2 shapes that moved beneath the waves. For the blood of the Selkies runs deeper than memory, and the sea never truly releases what it has once claimed as its own. In the deep winter nights of medieval Germany, when frost painted intricate patterns on cottage windows and the wind howled through the black forests like a living thing, sleep was not the refuge it should have been. In the village of Rothenburg, nestled in a valley where the Tauber River wound between snow-laden fir trees, there lived a young miller's daughter named Greta, whose nights had become a battlefield. Between wakefulness and a terror that had no name, it began, as such visitations often do, with a feeling of being watched. Greta would wake in the darkest hours before dawn, her heart hammering against her ribs, certain that someone or something stood in the shadows of her small chamber. The air would be thick and oppressive, as if a thunderstorm were about to break. Yet outside her window, the winter sky remained clear and merciless with cold. At first, she blamed her unease on the war that raged in distant lands, the stories of which reached even their remote valley through travelling merchants and soldiers seeking shelter. But as the weeks passed and her sleep grew more fitful, Greta began to understand that her torment came from something far older and more malevolent than the conflicts of men. The attacks came with the new moon, when darkness lay heaviest upon the land. Greta would find herself paralyzed in her bed, unable to move or cry out, while a crushing weight settled upon her chest. She could feel it there, a presence both alien and horribly intimate, pressing down upon her with the weight of granite. Her breathing became labored, each gasp a struggle against an invisible hand that seemed determined to squeeze the very life from her lungs. In those terrible moments of helplessness, she could sense rather than see the thing that tormented her. It was small and hunched, its form shifting like smoke, sometimes appearing as a wizened old woman with wild hair and burning eyes, other times as a dark, shapeless mass that pulsed with malevolent life. The creature's touch was ice cold, yet it left her skin burning as if she had been branded. When morning finally came, Greta would wake, exhausted, her nightgown drenched in sweat, strange bruises blooming across her chest and arms. Her father, Klaus, was a practical man who had little patience for what he called women's fancies. But even he could not ignore the change in his daughter. Greta grew pale and hollow-eyed, her once rosy cheeks taking on the waxy pallor of a corpse. She picked at her food like a bird, claiming that nothing had taste anymore, and she developed a nervous habit of constantly looking over her shoulder, as if expecting to see something terrible lurking in the corners of familiar rooms. The village-wise woman, Mother Bertha, knew immediately what plagued the miller's daughter. When Klaus finally swallowed his pride and sought her counsel, "The Ma has chosen her," the old woman said, her gnarled fingers working nervously at the iron amulet that hung around her neck. "It is an old hunger, older than our church, older than our God. The Night Rider seeks to steal more than sleep. It feeds on the very essence of life itself." Mother Bertha explained that the Ma was a demon of the threshold, a creature that existed in the space between sleep and waking, between the world of the living and the realm of nightmares. It could take many forms, sometimes appearing as an animal, a cat or horse, that would settle upon the chest of its victim, other times manifesting as a hideous hag with iron teeth and claws like rusted nails. But always, its purpose was the same: to drain the life force of mortals while they lay helpless in sleep's embrace. Iron Mother Bertha whispered, pressing a cold nail into Greta's palm. "Place it beneath your pillow, child. The old spirits fear iron above all things, for it is the metal of this world, solid and true. And they are creatures of shadow and deception, but iron alone was not enough." The Ma had tasted Greta's essence and found it sweet, and it would not be easily deterred. Night after night, it returned, growing bolder and more vicious with each visitation. Greta would wake to find scratches on her arms that had not been there when she went to bed, and sometimes she would taste blood in her mouth, though she could find no wound. The breaking point came on the night of the winter solstice, when the darkness was deepest and the veil between worlds grew thin as gossamer. Greta woke to find the Ma fully materialized beside her bed, not the half-glimpsed shadow she had grown accustomed to, but a creature of horrible, tangible reality. It stood no taller than a child, but its body was twisted and ancient. Its skin, the color of old leather, stretched tight over bones that jutted at unnatural angles. Its eyes were holes in its skull, wells of darkness that seemed to pull at her soul, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with teeth like broken glass. When it smiled, Greta could see her own reflection in those terrible teeth, distorted and terrified. The creature spoke then, its voice like the whisper of wind through a graveyard, promising her eternal rest if she would only stop fighting, only let herself sink into the darkness it offered. But Greta had not survived 18 winters in the German forests to surrender to a nightmare. As the Ma reached for her with fingers like twigs, she grasped the iron nail Mother Bertha had given her and drove it deep into the creature's outstretched hand. The demon shrieked, a sound like breaking glass and dying animals, and its form began to dissolve like smoke in wind. "You cannot escape me," it hissed as it faded. I know your scent now, your taste. I will find you in every shadow, in every moment when your guard falls. Sleep will never again bring you peace, yet the Ma was wrong. Greta had wounded it with iron and will, and though it would try to return in the nights that followed, its power over her was broken. She learned to sleep with iron beneath her pillow, to ward her windows with rowan branches, to speak prayers in the old tongue that Mother Bertha taught her. The demon became a memory, then less than a memory, a half-remembered fear that lost its teeth in the light of day. But sometimes, even years later when she had married and had children of her own, Greta would wake in the deep hours before dawn with the taste of terror in her mouth and the phantom weight of something pressing down upon her chest. And she would know that somewhere in the darkness, the Ma still remembered her name, for every sleeper who has ever woken gasping in the night, every child who has cried of monsters in their room, every soul who has felt that crushing weight upon their chest in the hours when the veil grows thin. They have all felt the touch of the night riders, those ancient demons who feast on fear and feed on the breath of the dreaming. The iron may ward them off, the prayers may give us comfort, but they are always there, waiting in the space between sleep and waking, patient as the darkness itself. In the peat bogs and heather-covered hills of County Mayo, where ancient stone circles stand like broken teeth against the grey Irish sky, the boundary between the world of mortals and the realm of the Sealy Court has always been perilously thin. Here, in the shadow of Croagh Patrick, the holy mountain where St. Patrick himself once fasted and prayed, families have learned to guard their children with iron and prayer. For the fair folk have appetites that mortal hearts cannot fathom. Bridget O'Malley knew the old warnings as well as any woman in the village of Westport. She had grown up with her grandmother's tales of babies stolen in the night and replaced with things that only seemed human, of fairy children left to wither and die, while the stolen mortals danced forever in halls beneath the hollow hills. But knowledge and vigilance are different things, and on the night her son Sheen was born beneath a harvest moon that hung like a golden eye in the autumn sky, Bridget made the mistake that countless mothers before her had made. She forgot, in her joy and exhaustion, to keep the fire burning bright. Sheen was a beautiful child, born with a crown of dark hair and eyes the colour of a summer sky. For 3 months, he grew strong and bright, his laughter filling their small cottage like music, his tiny hands reaching for the shafts of sunlight that streamed through their single window. Bridget's husband, Seamus, would hold the boy for hours, singing the old songs in Gaelic while Sheen gazed up at him with an intelligence that seemed almost otherworldly. It was on the night of Samhain, when the veil between worlds grows thin as cobweb, that everything changed. Bridget had fallen asleep while nursing the baby, the fire in their hearth burning low, the protective circle of salt around Sheen's cradle disturbed where her skirt had brushed against it. The cottage was filled with a silvery light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and in that light, figures moved with grace too fluid to be entirely human. They were tall and impossibly slender, their faces beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, their eyes holding depths that spoke of centuries spent watching the world of men from the shadows. Their leader, a woman whose hair flowed like moonlight made tangible, approached Sheen's cradle with steps that made no sound on the earthen floor. "Such a lovely child," the fairy queen whispered, her voice like wind through silver bells. "So full of mortal life, so bright with possibility. We would treasure him in our realm, teach him songs that mortal throats were never meant to sing, show him wonders that would burn out human eyes with their beauty." Bridget tried to move, to cry out, to defend her child, but she found herself frozen, able only to watch as the fairy queen lifted Sheen from his cradle. The baby did not cry. Instead, he laughed with delight, reaching tiny fingers toward the ethereal beings that surrounded him. In his place, the queen laid another child, one that looked identical to Sheen in every way save for the coldness. In its blue eyes and the strange, knowing smile that played about its lips. "Do not grieve over much," the fairy queen said as she cradled the real Sheen against her breast. "We leave you a child to raise, one of our own blood who will bring you years of joy. Only remember that fairy children are not mortal children, and what feeds their kind is not what nourishes yours." When morning came, Bridget convinced herself it had been a dream born of new motherhood and winter melancholy. The child in the cradle looked exactly like her Sheen, after all, and when Seamus woke, he noticed nothing amiss. But as the days passed, subtle wrongness began to creep into their lives, like frost forming on window glass. The changeling child, for that is what it was, possessed an appetite that seemed bottomless. It would nurse for hours without ever seeming satisfied, draining Bridget until she grew pale and weak. It cried incessantly, a thin, reedy wail that set the teeth on edge, and made the cottage's few animals restless and afraid. Most disturbing of all, it seemed to know things no infant should know, following conversations with its strange ancient eyes and sometimes laughing at jokes it could not possibly understand. The village wise woman, Granny Maloney, recognized the signs immediately when Bridget brought the child to her in desperation. "That's no mortal babe you're carrying," the old woman said, crossing herself. "Look at its eyes, child. Look how it watches us, like it's studying us for some purpose we can't fathom." Granny Maloney taught Bridget the old tests, the ways to confirm what she already knew in her heart. She placed an eggshell before the fire and began to brew tea in it, a task so absurd that only one who had lived far longer than any human child could find it remarkable. The changeling sat up in its cradle, something no 3-month-old should be able to do, and spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. "In all my hundreds of years, I have never seen brewing done in an eggshell." The truth revealed, Granny Maloney explained the ways to reclaim a stolen child, though the methods were dangerous and not always successful. Some said you must threaten to burn the changeling, that the fairy folk would return the human child rather than see one of their own harmed. Others claimed you must take the changeling to a place of power, a fairy fort or ancient stone circle, and demand an exchange. But Bridget chose a different path, one born of desperate maternal love and reckless courage. On the next Samhain night, she carried the changeling to the fairy fort that crowned the hill behind their cottage, a circular earthwork older than memory where the local people still left offerings of milk and bread. There, as midnight approached and the northern lights danced green fire across the sky, she called out to the fairy queen. "I know what you are," she cried, holding the changeling high, "and I know what you've taken from me. Give me back my son, or I swear by Saint Patrick and all the saints that I will raise this child of yours in the mortal world. Feed it mortal food, teach it mortal ways, until its fairy nature withers and dies." The air grew cold, colder than any earthly winter, and the fairy queen materialized from the swirling mist, her beautiful face terrible with ancient rage. In her arms she held Sheen, who had grown in his months among the fair folk but remained recognizably himself. The exchange was made in silence, mother's arms finding son, fairy queen reclaiming her own. But as Bridget turned to leave, the fairy queen's voice followed her down the hill like a curse. "You have won this night, mortal woman, but know that we are patient as the stones, and we remember every slight. Your line is marked now, generation unto generation. We will come for your children's children, and their children after them, until the debt is paid in full. Sheen grew to manhood strong and true, though he bore always a mark of his time in fairyland, a small ability to see things others could not, to hear whispers in the wind that spoke of worlds beyond the mortal realm. He married and had children of his own, and they had children after them, and still the fairy curse hung over the O'Malley line, like a sword suspended by a spider's thread. For in every generation since, when the moon is dark, and the wind carries strange music from the hills, the fair folk return to test the vigilance of Sheen's descendants. Sometimes they succeed, spiriting away a child to their timeless realm, leaving behind a changeling whose presence slowly drains the joy from mortal homes. And sometimes they fail, thwarted by iron and faith, and a mother's love that burns brighter than any fairy glamour. But they never stop trying, for the fair folk are creatures of contract and obligation, and a debt once incurred echoes through the centuries like a bell that never stops ringing, calling the fairy host to collect what they believe is rightfully theirs, from the children of those who dared to outwit the lords and ladies of the hollow hills. In the shadowed bayous of Louisiana, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds from ancient cypress trees and the air itself seems thick with secrets, the descendants of French colonists brought with them more than just their language and customs. They carried in their blood the old curses of the homeland, curses that found fertile ground in the humid darkness of the New World's swamps. Among these inherited burdens, none was more feared than the curse of the rougarou, a transformation that passed from father to son like a poison in the veins. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau knew the weight of his family's shame long before he understood its true nature. Growing up in the settlement of Vermilionville in the 1890s, he noticed how other Cajun families would cross themselves when his grandfather, Papa Alcide, walked past their homes. How conversations would die when the old man entered the general store, and how mothers would pull their children close when his shadow fell across their path. Papa Alcide was a traitor, a folk healer who knew the old ways of treating ailments with herbs and prayers. But there was something else about him that made people uneasy. He was a man of many absences, disappearing for days at a time during certain phases of the moon. Returning haggard and wild-eyed with scratches on his arms he claimed came from hunting in the thick undergrowth. When pressed about these excursions, he would only mutter about paying the family's debt and retreat to his cabin deep in the swamp. The truth came to Jean-Baptiste on his 16th birthday, when Papa Alcide took him deeper into the bayou than he had ever been before, to a place where the water ran black as sin and the trees grew so thick that even at midday, the world existed in a perpetual twilight. There, in a clearing marked by a circle of white stones that seemed to glow with their own inner light, the old man finally revealed the burden that had haunted the Thibodeau men for 7 generations. "We are not like other families," Papa Alcide said, his weathered hands trembling as he spoke. "Our ancestor, Philippe Thibodeau, came to Louisiana fleeing more than just poverty in the old country. He carried with him a curse laid upon him by a priest he had wronged, a holy man whose sacred vessels Philippe had stolen to buy passage to the New World. The priest's dying words bound our bloodline to a penance that would last until the sin was paid in full. The curse was precise in its cruelty. On the night of each full moon, the eldest Thibodeau male would feel the change beginning in his bones, a fire that started in the marrow and spread outward until his very flesh rebelled against its human shape. But this was not the random savagery of a common werewolf. The rougarou retained its human mind, trapped, conscious, and aware within the wolf's body. forced to hunt and kill while knowing exactly what it was doing. The worst part, Papa Alcide whispered, his eyes reflecting the swamp's eerie light, is not the transformation itself, but what comes after. When dawn breaks and you return to human form, you remember everything, every hunt, every kill, every drop of blood that has passed your lips. The wolf's hunger becomes your hunger, and you must live with the knowledge of what you have done. Papa Alcide explained that the curse could be passed to another only through a deliberate act of bloodshed. The current Rougarou had to draw blood from the chosen successor during his transformed state, marking them with the wolf's bite. Until that transfer occurred, the burden remained with the eldest male, growing heavier with each passing moon. I have carried this weight for 40 years, the old man said, rolling up his sleeves to reveal arms covered in scars, some clearly self-inflicted. I have tried everything to break the curse. Prayers, pilgrimages, consultations with priests who would listen. Nothing works. The sin is too deep, the debt too old. But I am dying, Jean-Baptiste, and the curse must have somewhere to go. It will not die with me. Jean-Baptiste recoiled from his grandfather's words, but Papa Alcide's eyes held a terrible certainty. You can run, boy, but it will find you. The curse knows its own blood. Better to accept it here, where I can teach you to control it, than to have it take you unprepared in some distant place, where your family cannot help you understand what you've become. That night, as the full moon rose over the bayou like a diseased eye, Jean-Baptiste watched his grandfather undergo the transformation that would soon be his own inheritance. Papa Alcide's human form dissolved in agony, bones cracking and reforming, skin rippling as coarse fur erupted from every pore. His face elongated into a wolf's muzzle, his fingers became claws, and his eyes changed from human brown to the pale yellow of a predator. But it was the sound of the transformation that haunted Jean-Baptiste most. Not the physical changes, but Papa Alcide's voice, crying out in anguish as his human soul was locked away inside the wolf's body, still present but powerless to stop what was about to happen. The Rougarou that stood where his grandfather had been looked at Jean-Baptiste with recognition and terrible sadness before loping off into the dark water to hunt. Jean-Baptiste waited 3 days before Papa Alcide returned to human form, collapsing naked and bloody at the edge of the clearing. The old man's eyes were haunted, his body covered in fresh wounds, and when he spoke, his voice was hollow with despair. I killed a deer, Papa Alcide said, though they both knew it was a lie meant to spare them both the full truth. The hunger was not as strong this time. Perhaps the curse is weakening as I age. But Jean-Baptiste could see the fresh scratches on a nearby cypress tree, claw marks too high to have been made by any deer, and he could smell something else on his grandfather's breath, something metallic and wrong that made his stomach churn. When they returned to Vermilionville, Jean-Baptiste noticed how the other families looked at Papa Alcide with new fear, how mothers counted their children more carefully, and how the local priest began holding special prayer services for protection against the evil that walks in the night. Papa Alcide died that winter, but Jean-Baptiste felt the curse take root in his blood like a cancer. When the next full moon rose, he understood at last the true horror of his inheritance. The transformation was agony beyond description. But worse was the moment when his human consciousness became a prisoner in the wolf's body, forced to watch helplessly as ancient hungers drove him into the dark heart of the bayou. Papa Alcide died that winter, but Jean-Baptiste felt the curse take root in his blood like a cancer. When the next full moon rose, he understood at last the true horror of his inheritance. The transformation was agony beyond description. But worse was the moment when his human consciousness became a prisoner in the wolf's body, forced to watch helplessly as ancient hungers drove him into the dark heart of the bayou. For 60 years, Jean-Baptiste carried the burden of the rougarou, learning to isolate himself during the dangerous nights, building a life around the terrible monthly rhythm of his curse. He never married, never had children of his own, hoping the bloodline would end with him. But curses are patient things, and blood calls to blood across the generations. On his deathbed, Jean-Baptiste discovered that his brother's grandson, a boy who had grown up far from the bayous in the bright lights of New Orleans, carried the same genetic marker that made him susceptible to the family curse. The old man's final act was to send a letter north, a confession and a warning, that arrived too late to prevent the young man from coming south to claim his inheritance. And so the curse continues, passing from uncle to nephew, from father to son, a werewolf's legacy that transforms not just flesh but souls, creating monsters who remember every detail of their crimes. In the deep Louisiana swamps, where the water runs dark and the Spanish moss whispers secrets in languages older than French or English, the rougarou still hunts beneath the full moon, carrying forward a debt that 7 generations have been unable to pay. In the fjord-carved landscape of western Norway, where granite cliffs rise like cathedral walls from waters so deep they swallow light itself, the winter nights stretch longer than human memory can comfortably hold. Here, in the fishing village of Alisant, perched on islands connected by bridges that seem to hang suspended between sea and sky, the people have learned to trust their senses less than visitors might expect, for in this land of endless twilight and aurora-painted skies, reality itself sometimes arrives ahead of schedule. Lars Eriksson was a man of precise habits, as steady and reliable as the tides that governed his life as a fisherman. Each morning at 4:30, his neighbors would hear his heavy boots on the wooden stairs of his boarding house, the creak of the front door opening, and the distinctive sound of his approach down the cobblestone street toward the harbor. His footsteps had a particular rhythm, favoring his left leg slightly due to an old injury from a fall on icy deck planks, and his cough carried on the salt air in a way that announced his presence long before his lantern came into view. So when Astrid Haugen, the baker's wife, heard Lars walking past her window at precisely 4:30 on that February morning in 1923, she thought nothing of it. She was already awake, kneading dough for the day's bread, and she glanced up from her work to nod at his passing shadow beyond the frost-etched glass. She heard his familiar cough, saw the bob of his lantern light, and even caught a glimpse of his distinctive yellow rain slicker through the swirling snow. But when Astrid's husband returned home an hour later with troubling news, her world tilted on its axis in a way that would never quite right itself again. "Poor Lars," Olaf said, stamping snow from his boots in their small entryway, "found dead in his bed this morning. Old Mrs. Lindquist went to check on him when he didn't show up at the docks. The doctor thinks his heart gave out sometime during the night." Astrid's hands stilled in the bread dough, her mind struggling to reconcile what her husband had just told her with what she had seen with her own eyes. "That cannot be," she whispered. "I saw him this morning. I heard him walking to work, same as always." But even as she spoke, a chill that had nothing to do with the February wind began to settle in her bones. She had witnessed something that Norwegian folklore had long recognized, but that the modern world preferred to dismiss: the Vardager, the fetch, the ghostly double that precedes its living counterpart like a shadow cast by future events. The phenomena had been documented for centuries in the remote corners of Scandinavia, where the long polar nights and isolation created conditions ripe for supernatural encounters. Unlike other forms of supernatural manifestation, the Vardøger was not malevolent in nature. It was simply a fact of existence in the northern lands, as natural as the aurora borealis, and just as impossible to explain through conventional means. Dr. Erik Nordahl, a scholar of folklore from the University of Oslo who had come to study the fishing communities of the western fjords, found himself documenting case after case of Vardøger encounters. In his meticulous notes, preserved now in the university's archives, he recorded testimony from dozens of witnesses who claimed to have heard, seen, or even spoken with individuals who were later found to be miles away or, in some tragic cases, already dead. The phenomenon appears most commonly in tight-knit communities, where individuals follow predictable patterns, Dr. Nordahl wrote. The Vardøger manifests as a perfect replica of a person's usual arrival routine. Witnesses report hearing familiar footsteps, voices, and other identifying sounds. Visual sightings are less common but not unknown. The experience is so convincing that observers often interact with the apparition, receiving normal responses. The most disturbing cases in Dr. Nordahl's files involved sightings of the Vardøger that preceded death rather than ordinary arrival. These incidents followed a pattern that chilled him to research. The ghost would appear, performing its usual routine flawlessly, only for the real person to be discovered deceased, often having died hours before their Vardøger was observed. One such case involved Ingrid Olsen, a midwife who was known throughout the region for her punctuality and distinctive singing voice. On the night of March 15th, 1924, 3 separate families reported hearing Ingrid's voice outside their homes, singing the old lullabies she was famous for as she made her rounds to check on new mothers and babies. Each family had prepared to receive her, setting out coffee and small cakes as was customary, but Ingrid never arrived at any of their doors. She was found the next morning at the bottom of a ravine, her medical bag still clutched in her frozen hands, her body bearing evidence of a fall that the local constable estimated had occurred before midnight, hours before her voice was heard singing in the village streets. The theory suggested that the Vardøger might be the Hugar attempting to fulfill the deceased person's final earthly obligations, driven by such strong routine and purpose, that it continued to function even after the body had ceased. The psychological impact of Vardøger encounters on the close-knit communities was profound. Families began to question every sighting of their loved ones, wondering if they were witnessing the living person, or some ghostly harbinger of tragedy to come. The phenomenon created a strange doubling of reality where the familiar became sinister, where the sound of a loved one's approach could herald either reunion or loss. Young Nils Andersen experienced this uncertainty firsthand, when his mother's Vardøger began appearing regularly in the weeks before her death from consumption. He would hear her moving about their small house, preparing meals, humming the songs she sang while mending nets. But when he went to find her, he would discover her asleep in her bed, weakened by illness and barely conscious. The Vardøger was taking over her daily routines as her body failed, a ghostly caretaker ensuring that life continued its familiar patterns even as death approached. It was as if she was practicing for her departure, Nils told Dr. Nordahl years later, teaching us to hear her presence even when she was no longer truly there. The doctor's research was cut short when he himself became the subject of a Vardøger sighting. Mrs. Haugen, the same baker's wife who had seen Lars Eriksson's fetch, reported observing Dr. Nordahl walking past her window one evening, his distinctive white beard and academic bearing unmistakable even in the dim light. She prepared to greet him the next morning, only to learn that he had departed Alesund on the afternoon boat. hours before she claimed to have seen him. Dr. Nordal's final notes on the phenomenon were found among his papers after his death in Oslo 2 years later. The Vardiga suggests that our understanding of individual identity may be far more complex than modern science acknowledges. If consciousness can indeed precede or outlast physical presence, then death itself may be merely another arrival, announced by the shadow of what we are about to become. In the fishing villages of western Norway, where winter nights still stretch longer than memory, and the aurora borealis continues to paint impossible colors across the sky, the people still listen carefully when they hear familiar footsteps approaching their doors, for they know that in this land where reality bends like light through ice, the person you see arriving may not be the person who is actually coming home. In the windswept villages of medieval Bohemia, where stone churches stood like sentinels against the endless rolling hills and the dead were buried deep to keep them from walking, there existed a love story that would become a cautionary tale, whispered by generations of mourners. It was a story that began with devotion so pure it defied death itself, and ended with the terrible understanding that some loves are too dangerous to survive the grave. Vakulov Novak was a blacksmith in the village of Rikany, a man whose hands could shape iron into works of beauty that made the local nobles travel from Prague to commission his work. But for all his skill with metal and flame, his greatest creation was the love he shared with his wife, Bosna, a weaver whose laughter could brighten even the darkest winter days. They had been married for 7 years, blessed with a happiness that made their neighbors both envious and protective. For such joy seemed too perfect for this harsh world, when the plague came sweeping through Bohemia in the autumn of 1348. It took Bosna with a swiftness that left Vakulov stunned by the cruelty of fate. She sickened on a Tuesday, her skin burning with fever, her breathing growing labored as black swellings appeared beneath her arms. By Friday, she was dead, her body wrapped in linen and buried in the consecrated ground behind the village church before the sun set on that terrible day. Vakulov's grief was a living thing that consumed him from within. He stopped working at his forge, letting commissions go unfulfilled while he spent his days at Bosna's graveside, speaking to her as if she could still hear his voice. The village priest, Father Tomas, tried to counsel him about acceptance and God's will, but Vakulov's faith had been shattered by loss. He could not understand why a loving God would take such a pure soul while leaving monsters and sinners to prosper. "Bring her back," Vakulov whispered to the stone cross that marked his wife's grave. "I would give anything, pay any price, make any bargain. Just bring her back to me." It was on the night of All Hallows Eve, when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grows thin as morning mist, that Vakulov's desperate prayers were answered. He had fallen asleep against Bosna's headstone, his body racked with sobs, when a sound woke him. It was a soft scratching, like fingernails against wood, coming from beneath the earth. The soil of the grave began to shift and crack, not violently as if something were clawing its way out, but gently, almost carefully, as if the earth itself were parting in reverence. A pale hand emerged, then an arm clothed in the burial shroud that Vakulov had helped to wrap around his beloved's body. Bosna rose from her grave like a flower blooming in reverse, her movements graceful despite the fact that rigor mortis should have made such fluidity impossible. She looked exactly as she had in life, her skin pale but unmarked by decay, her dark hair still soft and lustrous. When she smiled at Vakulov, it was with the same warmth that had first captured his heart, and when she spoke, her voice carried the musical quality he had dreamed of hearing again. "My darling," she said, reaching out to touch his face with fingers that felt cold but familiar. "I heard you calling for me. Love has brought me back to you." Vaclav wept with joy as he gathered his returned wife in his arms, feeling the solid reality of her body, breathing in the scent that was uniquely hers. She felt real, she sounded real, and in his overwhelming relief and happiness, he chose not to question the miracle that had restored her to him. They returned to their cottage together, and for a time, Vaclav's life resumed a semblance of its former contentment. Bosna moved through their home with the same familiar grace, tending to the hearth, preparing his meals, sleeping beside him in their bed. To any casual observer, she seemed exactly as she had been in life, perhaps a little paler, a little quieter. But grief and illness could account for such changes. But as the weeks passed, subtle wrongness began to creep into their restored happiness, like shadows lengthening at dusk. Bosna's skin remained cold to the touch, never warming despite the heat of their fire or the warmth of their shared bed. She ate the food he prepared for her, but he never saw her swallow, and the meals seemed to disappear without nourishing her in any visible way. Most disturbing of all were her eyes. In life, Bosna's eyes had been windows to her soul, reflecting every emotion with transparent honesty. But the eyes of the woman who had returned from the grave were different. They watched him with an intensity that felt calculating rather than loving, studying his face as if memorizing features she should have known by heart. The village began to whisper when Bosna appeared in the market square, moving through the stalls where she had once laughed and gossiped with other wives. The other women found excuses to avoid her, crossing themselves when they thought she wasn't looking, and mothers pulled their children close when she passed. Animals reacted to her presence with instinctive fear, dogs whimpering and backing away, cats arching their backs and hissing at something only they could perceive. Father Tomas noticed the changes too, and his attempts to speak with Bosna about her miraculous return were met with evasion and excuses. When he suggested she attend Mass to give thanks for her restoration, she claimed sudden illness whenever Sunday morning arrived. Holy water seemed to cause her genuine discomfort, and she could no longer enter the church where she had once prayed daily. The truth began to reveal itself in fragments that Vaclav's desperate love refused to acknowledge. Bosna cast no reflection in their polished metal mirror, though she seemed unaware of this absence. She left no footprints in mud or snow, moving across the ground as if she weighed nothing at all. And in the deepest hours of the night, when she thought Vaclav was sleeping, he would sometimes catch her staring at him with an expression of hunger that had nothing to do with love. The final revelation came when Vaclav discovered that the thing he had been sleeping beside was slowly draining his life force, feeding on his vitality as a vampire feeds on blood. Each morning, he woke weaker, paler, more hollow-eyed, while Bosna seemed to grow more solid, more present, more real. She was using his life to fuel her unnatural existence, and his desperate love was the rope she used to anchor herself to the world of the living. When Father Tomas finally confronted Vaclav with the truth, the blacksmith's denial was fierce and tragic. "You ask me to destroy the only happiness I have left," he said. "You ask me to send away the woman I love more than life itself." "That is not the woman you loved," the priest replied gently. "That is something wearing her face, using your memories against you. Bosna's soul has moved on to its eternal rest. What you harbor in your home is a revenant, a hollow thing that feeds on your refusal to let her go. But love, even when it becomes a poison, is not easily abandoned." Vaclav continued to live with the creature that had taken his wife's form, allowing it to drain his life day by day rather than face the loneliness of letting her go. The villagers found him 6 months later, dead in his bed, beside a thing that looked like Bosana, but crumbled to dust when the morning sunlight touched its borrowed flesh. In the centuries since, in every village where the dead are buried, and the living mourn too deeply, the same tragedy has played out with variations, but never with different endings. For the love that refuses to acknowledge death's dominion becomes a beacon for things that should remain in their graves, and the heart that will not heal becomes a feast for hungers that have no name, no mercy, and no end save the final darkness that claims both the living and their beloved dead. And so we return from our journey through the shadowed corners of Europe, where the boundary between human and monster proves to be not a wall of flesh and bone, but a threshold as fragile as the skin that barely contains what we truly are. Perhaps every tale we have explored reminds us of a chilling truth, that transformation is not always a curse inflicted from without, but a revelation of what has always lurked within. From the Beast of Gévaudan, whose intelligence spoke of a man trapped within a wolf's hunger, to the false beloved who wear the faces of our deepest loves. These shapeshifters serve as mirrors reflecting our own capacity for becoming something other than what we appear. The Selkies' stolen skin teaches us that love without freedom becomes imprisonment, while the mare's nightly visitations remind us that our most vulnerable moments are when the masks we wear by day slip away in sleep. The changeling's substitution forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that those closest to us might not be who they seem. And the Rougarou's generational curse shows us how the sins of our ancestors can transform not just our flesh, but our souls. The Vardage's premature arrival suggests that identity itself may be more fluid than we dare imagine, while the Revenant's return from the grave proves that even death cannot always sever the bonds that bind us to those who refuse to let us go. These are not merely tales of supernatural horror, but explorations of the fundamental questions that have haunted humanity since we first gazed into still water and wondered at our own reflection. Who are we when the lights go out and the civilized world falls away? What appetites prowl beneath our carefully constructed personas? How well do we truly know the people we share our beds with, our homes with, our lives with? In an age of DNA testing and biometric scanning, of security cameras and digital footprints, we tell ourselves that identity is fixed, that we can know with certainty who someone is and where they belong. Yet the old stories persist, whispering of a time when the people understood that the self is not a fortress but a fluid thing, capable of change, of loss, of becoming something entirely other. Walk through any European city today, and you will find the descendants of those who once feared the shapeshifters of our tales. They lock their doors against the night, install motion sensors and alarm systems, carry identification cards that promise to verify their humanity. But still, in the small hours when sleep strips away their defenses, they sometimes wake with the weight of something pressing down upon their chest, or catch a glimpse of movement in their peripheral vision that suggests they are not as alone as they believed. For the shapeshifters of legend were never really about the creatures themselves, but about the recognition that beneath the surface of every human face lies the capacity for transformation, for deception, for becoming something that those who love us might not recognize when the change is complete. The beast still prowls the high places where civilization grows thin. The Selkies still call from cold northern waters to those who would cage what should run free. The mare still rides the chests of the sleeping, feeding on dreams turned to nightmares. The world may have forgotten the old words of warding, the iron talismans and sacred boundaries that once kept the shapeshifters at bay, but the need for such protections has not disappeared. It has simply taken new forms. Modern anxieties about the strangers among us, about the loved ones who seem to have changed overnight, about the nagging suspicion that the person in the mirror is not quite the person we remember being. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. That in our journey through the legends of Europe's shapeshifters, we have not been exploring the realm of the supernatural, but holding up a glass to our own nature, discovering that the most frightening monsters are not those who transform from human to beast, but those who remain perfectly, convincingly human while something else entirely looks out through their eyes, wearing our trust like a borrowed skin that never quite fits. The stories we tell ensure that the memory of what we are capable of becoming is never truly forgotten, never truly safe.